Hello everybody, welcome to episode 187 of Show Fever. Today we'll be going over The Great Gatsby. As you can see here, I have the Arcturus cover. Got a pretty cool looking spot on there. Back does look very elaborate and nice. And then yeah, you got the front. So The Great Gatsby, I honestly just ended up reading it because it's one of the most renowned classics. So I'll kind of start off with the story. So we get introduced to our main character, Nick Carraway, and we're trying to get some background on his family. We learned that his great uncle, I believe it was, or might have just been his uncle, came into wealth, and so that's why his family is very wealthy. Originally, he lived in the West, around the Chicago area, but then ultimately he ended up moving to New York along Long Island. So we see, like I said, as he ends up going to Long Island, and he starts interacting with people that he knows. So he has a cousin by the name of Daisy, now Buchanan, and she is a woman who has become a prominence, obviously with prominence because she was the same family as Nick, but also because she has married Tom Buchanan, who is also another very wealthy man who was previously, I believe, a football player or something like that. Now he plays polo and all of that, and he's very famous and well off. So we see they just kind of come, and we see that in fact, well, just kind of like the life that people during this time period live. We see some conversations that are obviously associated with this time period. We also get to see as we learn about Tom's polo, hobby, and all the stuff he has to go along with that. And we're trying to see as they speak. And we also see that Tom and Daisy aren't really quite, I don't know, like something's obviously wrong. And also here we get introduced to Jordan Baker, who will eventually become a love interest for Nick, and she is a pro golfer, and she's renowned pretty far and wide because of her golfing. So after that, we see as a So then after that, we see as Tom ultimately ends up taking Nick on a little adventure, and this little adventure ends up connecting to something that Jordan told Nick. So Jordan ended up revealing to Nick that it is believed that Tom in fact has a mistress. And so ultimately Tom ends up getting up with Nick. He's like, yo bro, I want to show you my girl even though you're my wife's cousin. So ultimately they end up going out to this auto shop. And at this auto shop we're introduced to the character of what's his name? I think it's George Wilson. I know it's Wilson, but Mr. Wilson I'll just say. Introduced to Mr. Wilson, who's wanting to buy a car off Tom, and then after that we see as Mr. Wilson's wife ends up coming downstairs, her name being Myrtle Wilson. We get a brief glimpse at her, and then we see as Tom and Nick end up leaving after this. So Myrtle is in fact the mistress of Tom, and we see ultimately as they end up getting together later on, through some secretive arrangements and all of that. And Nick ends up tagging along with this. So we kind of see as he kind of third wheels throughout all of this. So then the story ends up progressing, and we see throughout kind of this, we've been we've been hearing discussion about the Gatsby, and we've heard people talk about Jay Gatsby, and we know that Jay Gatsby is the neighbor of Nick, but they've never really interacted. Now here we see as Nick is invited to a party by Gatsby. And we see as there's a bunch of prominent people there. Nick ends up going. He kind of yaps with Gatsby a little bit, and they kind of converse and all of that. And we also see that Jordan's there, and they yap and everything. We see as Jordan and Gatsby end up talking, and there's kind of some banter and everything there. So then after that, we see as Gatsby ends up talking a little bit more with Nick, and ultimately they end up arranging to go on his hydroplane. They end up having a little meeting, and in this meeting we see as Gatsby ends up revealing to Nick that Jordan has a story to tell him, because apparently Jordan and Gatsby knew each other a little bit beforehand, but he's like, yes, Jordan has a story to tell you. So ultimately Nick's kind of like, why do I gotta go to Jordan for this? But he ends up going to Jordan, and Jordan in fact ends up telling Nick the backstory of Daisy. So apparently in their younger years, Daisy had kind of had a bit of like a wilder time in her youth, and ultimately this ended when she settled down with Tom. But there used to be, when she lived in the West, there used to be like young men preparing to go off to World War I, and she interacted with them a lot. Apparently there was like a boot camp around the area or something like that, and she interacted with a lot of these people. Now this is important as we learn later on. But yeah, so then after that, we see as Gatsby ends up coming back. He's like, yo, I knew Daisy back in that time, and I'm in fact in love with Daisy. And he reveals about how he had been one of the men that Daisy had been up with, and they had fell in love during this time, and he ultimately got sent off, and then this kind of broke it off a little bit. But he's like, I specifically have been looking for her. I bought this house across like the bay or harbor area from her house just because I wanted to get in contact with her once more. So we see them as Gatsby asks Nick to arrange for them to meet. So Nick ends up inviting Daisy over to his house, where ultimately Gatsby ends up coming in as well, and they get to reunite. And we see as they start taking it off once more, and everything seems swell. They, like I said, they start yapping, they start getting close once more, and this starts to develop. We see as Daisy starts coming over to Gatsby's more and more, and all this begins to continue. So one thing I'll mention here, though it's not really important for like the rest of the story, is prior to this, when Nick and Gatsby started meeting more often, we are introduced to a character by the name of Mayor Wolfsheim. He is a Jewish man who apparently has some association with organized crime in some way, and we never really learn what Gatsby does for work, though he is immensely wealthy. We learn that he kind of had like some connection to this dude who owned a yacht up in like the Great Lakes area for a time, and how he accidentally ended up in Oxford, but we never really learn what he does for work. So it's presumably left to us to believe that he was with organized crime somehow because there's a connection to Meyer Wolfsheim. But yeah, that's never really elaborated upon. But yeah, so during this time, like I said, Daisy and Gatsby keep meeting up. They keep speaking and all of that. And we see as Gatsby actually ends up coming over to the household of, Tom, Daisy, and them. And then we see Jordan Baker as well. And because Jordan Baker is staying at the Buchanan residence for the time being. But yeah, we see as they kind of talk and all of that. And we see as Tom starts to grow slowly suspicious of something going on between Daisy and Jay, or Gatsby. And so he starts looking into this, and he ends up learning about Gatsby and kind of comes to some conclusions about like what he does for work and all of that. And this leads ultimately to Tom, when they have another reunion. I'm sorry, I got jumbled up there a little bit, but once they have another like little meeting together, everyone ultimately decides, let's go out on the town. Though it's absurdly hot today, let's go out on the town and go do some stuff. So we see as Jordan, Daisy, Tom, Gatsby, and Nick all end up going out into New York, where they end up going to like this hotel place. And in this hotel place, we see that Tom, in fact, confronts Gatsby here because he is claiming that Gatsby's trying to steal his wife and all that, which he is trying to do, and that he's like trying to, I guess, not defame her, but like take her honor, and how he's saying like, she never really loved you and all of that. But then Gatsby ends up rebuttaling. He's like, no, she in fact did love me, and she has loved me this entire time. We see that Daisy kind of corroborates this a little bit. She's like, yeah, I do love him. And she mentioned about how she did love Tom at times, but never very often. So this is obviously very tragic for Tom. And one thing that we need to mention here is when they left the manor, what's her name? Jordan, Nick, and Tom all rode in this yellow car, owned by Gatsby, while Gatsby and Daisy rode in Tom's car, because I guess Tom wanted to ride in Gatsby's car. So we see actually as he stopped by the Wilson household, Wilson automotive place briefly, and we see that Wilson is kind of broke down a little bit because he's getting suspicious that someone is trying to take his wife. Someone is canoodling his wife. But yeah, so kind of back to the thing. So we see then as ultimately everything starts to get a little more heated, but then ultimately it ends up separating and everyone goes their own separate ways. We see as all of them end up going back home. We see also as Gatsby ends up going to the residence of Daisy and them, once more the Buchanan residence, and this is just to make sure that Daisy doesn't get like beat or anything, but Daisy ultimately does not. She ends up sleeping, going to bed, and everything is good. Then we see as Nick and Gatsby kind of speak after Gatsby had done this. And then we end up seeing, or at least going back to an event. Well, this isn't really the event that happened, but we end up then progressing a little bit, where we see, as we're in the perspective of George, I believe his name, George Wilson, and Myrtle Wilson. They're having an argument over whatever. I believe it was possibly due to her infidelity, but they get to arguing. And this ultimately leads to Myrtle rushing out of the house. She rushes out of the house, and what drives by is a yellow car, which absolutely obliterates her, killed on impact, because it was going like 60, 50 miles an hour, and it just hit her. She dies right there. And this makes Mr. Wilson, go crazy. He's like, oh, no, 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 because he just saw his wife get obliterated in front of him. But during this, we see as not Daisy, Jordan, Tom, and Nick are out on the town, and they end up coming past this, where we see as Tom ends up pulling up. He's like, yo, what's this? He ends up getting a closer look and sees that, in fact, his mistress has been hit by a car. And so we see that he goes and then talks with Mr. Wilson, and he's like, yeah, a yellow car was that hit her, and that yellow car that you saw me in the other day, that wasn't mine, actually. That was Jay Gatsby's car. And so we then know now that Mr. Wilson knows that Gatsby was the one who blasted his wife and drove along. So yeah, after this, we then see as Nick ends up going to Gatsby, and he speaks with him a little bit, and Gatsby ends up revealing that in fact Daisy was the one driving to this time, but she freaked out after this, so Gatsby ended up grabbing the wheel and drove off. That's the thing. They did not stop at all after hitting this woman, absolutely obliterating her. But yeah, so then we see as Wilson kind of starts breaking down. We are showing this one character. His name, he's got an odd Greek name, but yeah, he is the neighbor to Wilson, and we see that Wilson is absolutely disheveled. He's having trouble just functioning, and ultimately the neighbor's trying to calm him down, but he has to end up leaving because he's like, I can't stay and do this the whole time. So we then see as someone else is left to watch over Wilson. But this person allows Wilson to get away. Now, this was not a good thing, because we see that, in fact, Wilson knows because of Tom that Gatsby is somewhere. So we see as Gatsby ends up going around, and Nick ends up going back to see if Wilson is around, but he's like, oh crap, he's going to hunt down Gatsby. So we see as Nick tries to hunt down Wilson, but Wilson is slowly building his way towards Gatsby. And we see that because prior to this, Nick had spoke with Gatsby, and Gatsby had told him about how he's actually going to get on his pool and all that before he ends up leaving with Daisy. So we see as he gets in his pool, he's preparing all of that, and we see ultimately as Mr. Wilson finds Gatsby, and he has a revolver in hand, shoots Gatsby, and then blows his own head off. So yeah, that's the end of the Mr. Wilson and Gatsby story. And we see that as Nick comes back, and they ultimately end up discovering all of this. And Nick tries to get in contact with Daisy. She's like, yo, you need to know this because Gatsby is dead. But he's unable to get in contact with Gatsby or Tom because they've fled town. And we see as no one is really able to find the yellow car that did it, because Gatsby ultimately had ended up hiding this car in a garage. And yeah, so then we kind of get to the aftermath, where we see as Nick is trying to figure out how to plan Jay's funeral, but we see that Jay really had a lot of fake friends. Not even Wolfsheim is going to pull up to his his funeral. He ends up calling a bunch of friends and everything. All of them end up really giving him excuses. So Nick is one of the few people who actually come. We get to see as Mr. Gatsby's father, Mr. Gats, is in fact going to come to his funeral, and we get some little background information on Gatsby about how he's been on. They show a schedule and how he's been on the grind since he was a young kid. But yeah, we see that, and we also get a little bit of background information on Gatsby. We learn that he came from essentially nothing and made his way up through becoming a general in the World War and all of that. So we kind of see all this. It ultimately plays out, and then we see Gatsby's funeral. And at Gatsby's funeral, we see that there's only 3 cars, barely anyone showed up, and everything's kind of grim. But then we see as one person that we haven't seen, that I didn't even mention, we haven't seen since the beginning of the book. And this was when Nick first went to the party, and he saw this dude who was drunk in Gatsby's library, kind of looking around like, yo, these are real books. I don't know why he was focused on the reality of the books. We see that he, in fact, ends up showing up to this funeral for some reason. But yeah, that ultimately ends up going along. We see that Nick, after I believe it was 2 years, ends up heading back to Chicago, because he's like, yo, I'm not really built for the East. I'm not built for this type of people. So he ends up going back to Chicago. We see as he kind of goes around, reminisces. We see as he gets in contact with Jordan, and Jordan had offered go meet him up already on a date prior to the 2-year skip, and he ultimately ended up denying her. And then we see as he ends up getting back in contact with her, but she's like, yeah, I'm getting married to someone else now, and you really messed up. You kind of screwed me over there by not going to see me. But yeah, so that's all there really was for that. And so then I just kind of discussed what I thought of the story. So really, I don't really know why this is a classic, because I mean, yeah, it was a good book, but it just wasn't anything really to write home about, honestly. But I did really enjoy it. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy it. And everything was good about it, but like it just really wasn't climactic. It kind of was a slow burn. It doesn't really get really interesting until Myrtle gets hit by the car. But I mean, still, it's all right. I would recommend it. I'd give it probably a 5 out of 10. It's nothing crazy, but I do recognize why it could be considered a classic, but I also don't really personally get it. So yeah, that's all it really was for The Great Gatsby, and that's all I really have for episode 187 of Shelf Review. So thank you very much for watching.